So I definitely would not recommend any of these things. If you're planning a cross-country road trip or vacation, please realize that you might not have cell service in some areas of the country. Please buy a paper map. Please plan out your routes more than a few hours in advance. Welcome to the Personal Finance for PhDs podcast, a higher education in personal finance. I'm your host, Emily Roberts. This is Season 3, Episode 1, and today my guest is myself. I tell the story of when my husband and I moved from Durham, North Carolina to Seattle, Washington, a year after we finished our PhDs. I get into all the details of the logistics and finances of planning and executing our cross-country move, which we additionally turned into a vacation road trip. While we did a lot of things well with this move and our subsequent housing search in Seattle, I also point out the mistakes we made and unexpected expenses and challenges we encountered. I hope you will learn a lot from this story about long-distance moving and finding housing in a high cost of living city. If after you finish this episode, you want to learn more from and even work with me to navigate the finances of moving and starting a new job, please visit pfforphds.com/next. Without further ado, here's my money story. So thanks for joining me today for this slightly unusual episode. I'm not actually going to try to interview myself. I think that would be a little bit funny, but I will just tell you the story of this move that we did several years ago. So here is the background information. So this was in the summer of 2015. My husband Kyle and I had both defended our PhDs the previous summer. So we'd been done for almost a year. And in that year, Kyle had been basically doing a postdoc in his PhD advisor's lab. So sort of a short-term temporary postdoc where he was trying to finish up a couple papers, get those out the door, and then secure his next position. And I did not have the opportunity to stay in my PhD advisor's lab to do the same thing. But I also didn't really want to find a full-time job because I knew that we were leaving Durham soon. So in that year, I did a lot of different things. I started this business, Personal Finance for PhDs, and I also was freelance editing for some like side hustle kind of money. And I also actually did a short-term fellowship in DC in science policy. So I left Durham and lived in DC for a few months. And basically when I got back to Durham after that fellowship was when Kyle was finally ready to start applying for jobs. So in May 2018, he applied for several positions, a few postdocs and a few industry jobs, and he ended up getting 2 offers that he had to decide between by about the end of May. One was a job in industry and the other was a postdoc, and they were both really, really attractive offers, and it was a really tough decision for him which way to go, but ultimately he decided to take the industry position, which is in Seattle, Washington. So by about the end of May, beginning of June 2015, we knew we were headed to Seattle, and Kyle had some leeway over his start date, but he decided on an August 1st start date. We had to give 60 days notice to leave our rental townhouse in Durham. So that was about as fast as we could leave. So the first thing we did when we knew that we were definitely moving to Seattle and we had the rough time frame of when we would need to start living there was that we started searching for housing. Now, we had been accustomed to the Durham housing market, where it was pretty typical to, again, give 30 or 60 days notice when you were leaving a place, and also to arrange for your new lease around several weeks or maybe even up to a few months in advance. So we were kind of anticipating the same thing in Seattle, and we're really surprised to find that that actually isn't the case. In the Seattle rental market, everything operates on an immediate basis. So when apartments go up as being listed for rent, they are available immediately or available a few days in advance. So for us, starting our housing search at the end of May or beginning of June for actually moving in somewhere at the end of July, that timeline was not lined up. We still did the housing searching there in May and June because we wanted to familiarize ourselves with the rental market in Seattle, but we knew that none of the places that we were actually looking at would be the one that we would end up renting. But we did start to familiarize ourselves with the market, and we decided that we would look for housing only within about 1.5 miles of where Kyle's new work location was. we were really fortunate that his work was not in downtown Seattle, but it was pretty close to three residential neighborhoods that were much more reasonably priced than what you can find in downtown Seattle. So the rents we were looking at were not going to be super high. They were still much higher than what we were accustomed to paying in Durham, just because Seattle in general has a higher cost of living than Durham, but it wasn't like painful for us to look at those rent prices. And at that time, again, summer of 2015, the rental market in Seattle was really, really hot. And so we were hearing stories from other people who live there of like competing with many, many other people to submit rental applications and having to race to get applications in to actually secure a place that they wanted to live in. So we were anticipating this was going to be kind of a stressful process. But basically, we knew in June that we weren't going to be doing a housing search right then. All we could do was familiarize ourselves with the market and decide which neighborhoods we wanted to live in, the approximate price range we could expect to pay for what we wanted. We knew that actually finding and securing housing would have to wait until after we moved to Seattle, just a few days in advance of Kyle's start date, which was pretty stressful to hear about, a couple months in advance, but it's just the reality of that situation. So we knew we'd have to work around it. The next thing we tackled after determining that we weren't going to be able to secure housing yet was to actually start planning our move, how we were going to get ourselves and our car and our stuff from Durham to Seattle. And there were two main constraints that we were working with when we were planning that move. The first is what I just mentioned, that we knew that we were not going to have housing arranged in advance. We knew that we would have to arrange for housing once we arrived in Seattle. And the way that affected our move was that we literally had no address to deliver our stuff to. So the way that affected our moving planning was we had to think about the speed at which our stuff could transit across the country, and if that delivery would occur after Kyle's start date for work, when we were pretty sure we would have housing by then, or whether it would get there before we even arrived in Seattle. So we had to think about the speed of the transit of our stuff. And the other constraint could be what you might call our budget. So in the process of Kyle reviewing the offer that he received from his new employer, the offer included several components, salary, but also, other benefits, health insurance, and so forth, equity, because this is a startup. So he was reviewing all these components with the CEO after he received the offer to make sure he understood everything. And he just kind of offhandedly mentioned, oh, I didn't see that there was any relocation reimbursement within the offer. Do you guys do that? And the CEO said, oh, well, we haven't to this point, but let me look into it. And then got back to Kyle a day later and said that they would reimburse up to $5,000 for moving expenses. So I just wanted to tell you that story to kind of illustrate that negotiation can be as simple as just asking a question or pointing out something that you think, hey, did you really mean it that way? And, maybe that'll be a way of negotiating for you. Like for Kyle, he sort of did it almost accidentally. We later learned, after he actually started in his position, that he was the first long distance hire that they had ever made. He was employee number 12 or thereabouts for the company, and they'd always hired local within Seattle before that point. So it honestly probably just wasn't something they had ever had a candidate ask for. So it was really great that he just pointed it out, and we got, $5,000 for moving expenses out of that. So that was really awesome. So that was the kind of budget that we had to work with. We definitely wanted to keep our moving expenses within that $5,000 so that we wouldn't have to spend our own money and could ask for it all as reimbursement. So when we started researching methods of how to move your stuff cross country, which we had never done before, we kind of grouped them into a few different categories. So there's full service moving, which is when you hire people to move your stuff for you. Sometimes they pack it as well. Basically, they're going to load all your boxes into a big truck, and they're going to drive the truck cross country, and they're going to, unload it at the destination of your choice. Full service moving. And we ruled out full service moving because when we started asking for quotes, they were well above the entire $5,000 budget, so that wasn't going to work. And also, again, we did not have an address for the stuff to be delivered to. So we would have had to somehow arrange for storage in Seattle, and that seemed like a really big hassle. So we did not consider full service movers. On the other end of the spectrum is total DIY moving, which for us would have probably looked like renting some kind of moving truck and loading all of our stuff in and trailing our car behind the truck and driving all of it cross country again to our non-existent new address in Seattle and unloading it there. And we didn't really like the idea. I mean, DIY moving is awesome on the price because it is the least expensive way to do it if you're moving a lot of stuff. But it wasn't something that we really wanted to do with this particular move because we didn't really want to drive a truck that we were not familiar with across the entire country and, traverse all the terrain we were expecting. We also were concerned about having to keep our stuff secure all the way, driving across the country over multiple days. That didn't seem really fun. And again, we didn't have a place to go to once we were in Seattle. So we'd have to keep the truck with all of our stuff with us during the time we would do the housing search. And that all just seemed really difficult. And so it wasn't the kind of cross-country move that we wanted to do. So we also ruled out that total DIY method of moving, even though it would have been the least expensive. Now, what we settled on was kind of a happy medium, which was pod-based moving. So there are a bunch of companies that do pod-based moving. The most well-known one, the name brand, is Pods. And basically how they all work, broad strokes, is that they deliver this portable storage unit basically to your old residence, and you box up all your stuff and put it in this pod, and then they transport the pod cross country and deliver it to your new address. But one of the really attractive things for us about pod-based moving is that it's really easy to do storage at the back end. So I think most of the companies that we looked at would maybe include 3 days of storage in their base price, but they also would allow you to pay for additional storage time at a pretty low fee. So they would just basically keep the pod for you at their secure location until you were ready to have it delivered to your new address. So this method of moving really worked out the best for us because of our lack of address in Seattle. And it also is at sort of a medium price point between total DIY moving and full service moving. So in addition to moving most of our stuff within the pod, we also drove our own car cross country. And we had a lot of our possessions packed in our car as well. And we also turned that cross country road trip, which we could have done quite quickly in a few days. We took a little bit more time and made it into a cross-country road trip vacation. So instead of taking a few days to get cross-country, we took about a week and a half. So that was really attractive to us in terms of the speed of our stuff getting across the country and the storage at the back end, and us being able to take some time to get cross country as well, not having to speed cross country because we were paying for, every day we were renting a moving truck or trying to beat our stuff there or anything like that. So I'm going to go into a bit of detail about how we found the pod-based moving company that we actually use, because I think it's really instructive if you've never. Again, this is the first big move we'd ever done, and so we did a lot of research into it, and so I think this is a good model to follow if you are planning a long-distance move as well. So we ended up getting 7 quotes from different pod-based moving companies. And this included both, the price as well as the timing and logistics and everything, the storage on the back end, all the stuff that we could use to compare these different quotes. Now, of the 7 quotes we got, Pods, the name brand one, was the most expensive. And we really took a careful look at the 2 companies that came in with the 2 lowest quotes. The very lowest quote was from Door to Door, which I searched for it today, and I don't think it exists anymore. And the second lowest quote was from U-Pack, which does still exist. So Door to Door said they would take about 2.5 weeks to get our stuff cross country, and U-Pack said it would take about a week and a half. And the week and a half was a little bit more in line with what we envisioned for our vacation, but 2.5 weeks was also pretty acceptable. So that was okay for both of them. One interesting thing that I learned about pod-based moving is to look at the size of the pods themselves. So pods has a larger sized pod. It's about the size of a parking space, whereas U-Pack and door-to-door use smaller pods. So both of their pods would be about 2 pods to one single parking space. So for our size home, which was a 2-bedroom townhouse in Durham, pods recommended using 1 pod, and door-to-door and U-Pack both recommended using 2 pods. Now, we kind of had it in the back of our mind that they were overestimating the amount of space that we would need. And we were thinking that maybe we would be able to use just one of the smaller pods from U-Pack or door-to-door, possibly. Whereas with pods, because it was a larger pod, there was no option to downsize from that single pod. So in addition to pods being the most expensive quote and having that larger pod, we ruled out using them. So we're really just choosing between door-to-door and U-Pack. Ultimately, we decided to go with U-Pack, the second lowest quote that we received. And that was because, so what's typical is that the company delivers the pod to your parking space, and you take, sometimes it's up to 3 days to fill it up with your stuff, and they just pick it up and transit it for you. And then you unpack it on the back end. Door to door, for some weird reason, was not going to allow us to pack up our own pod. They were actually going to provide movers at no additional cost to us. We would have to be completely packed up and ready to go. They would have the movers just move all of our boxes into the pod, and we would go from there as normal. And their original quote for moving 2 pods across the country was $3,708. So before we actually started packing up, we did get rid of some of our stuff. We sold some, gave some away. We were trying to downsize a bit. And then when we actually got down to packing, which was on a Saturday, my parents actually came into town and helped us with the packing. We got all of our boxes from free sources on Craigslist and from local, grocery stores and liquor stores. So we did buy a few packing materials, but overall that stuff was not too expensive. So we basically got all of our stuff into boxes within a day and started with my parents loading the Relo cubes. And once basically all of our stuff was out of our house, we realized that it really would be possible for us to get everything into one Relo cube. So the next day on Sunday, Kyle and one of our friends who's really into this sort of thing, unloaded everything from the Relo cubes and packed it all back in, getting everything into one Relo cube, plus our car was pretty heavily loaded down with our remaining stuff. But dropping down to using only one Relo cube meant that the company's quote reduced to $2,472. So some of the other costs that we incurred that were directly associated with the moving of our stuff, is that we paid in advance for 1 month of storage on the back end in Seattle. That was $155. I believe it was a lower price to pay it in advance versus to pay it, closer, after the stuff had already arrived in Seattle. So we paid that up front just to give us a little bit more breathing room during our housing search. And we also ended up paying in Seattle $232 for a street permit to be allowed to put the Relo cube on the street while we unloaded it. I'm skipping ahead a little bit here, but when we ultimately did secure a place to live in Seattle, we basically just arranged for the Relo cube to be delivered, which I think they did we arranged it on a Friday and they delivered it on a Monday, and we had the street permit set up and everything. And we unloaded the entire cube in about 2.5 hours into our apartment, and then called and scheduled for the pickup, and they picked it up the following day. So total moving related expenses, direct, transiting our stuff across the country, moving related expenses that we asked to be reimbursed from Kyle's employer, that totaled $3,052.39. This summer, I'm putting forth extra support for PhDs undergoing career transitions into grad school, a postdoc, or a real job. If you're moving on to the next stage in your career or thinking about it, please visit pforphds.com/next to check out my articles, webinars, and coaching program. Allow me to come alongside you during this transition to ensure that you set yourself up for financial success. Okay, so taking a step back to when we were still in Durham, and we decided to embark on this cross-country vacation as well as cross-country move. Now, this is a strategy that we had used many times during grad school with obligation travel. So if we had to, quote unquote, if we had the opportunity to go somewhere, usually for a friend's wedding, we would try to combine, doing the main event, the wedding or whatever, with some other personal travel that would give us a little bit more of a vacation feel to what would otherwise be just an obligation trip. So in that same vein, we turned the obligation of moving cross country into a small vacation for us. And this was really a much needed break for rest and relaxation as well as moving. We were really not good about taking vacations, taking downtime for ourselves towards the end of grad school. Basically, we went on a honeymoon after we got married in 2010. And after that point, basically just did like traveling for holidays, traveling for weddings. We did go on a couple family vacations with my family. But we really had not planned anything that was just the two of us, just for ourselves in years. So this was really, really refreshing to be able to do this trip. And we also were hopeful that we were going to have a baby in the very near future. We weren't yet pregnant, but we were hopeful that was going to happen. And ultimately it did. And so we knew that taking a vacation by ourselves we would not have another opportunity to do that for a very long time. So that was another motivation to make the move into a vacation as well. So as far as the timing of the vacation and the move, we decided to give ourselves about a week prior to Kyle's August 1st start date so that we could search for housing in Seattle. So we timed our vacation/cross-country trip to have us arrive in Seattle about a week in advance of his start date. So Kyle and I are planners, especially around travel. And the crazy thing about this particular trip is that we did not really plan anything in advance. We were so consumed with Kyle wrapping up work, us, getting rid of our stuff and packing and arranging for all the moving stuff. Like, it was a lot of work. I mean, I wasn't even working a full-time job at that point, and I was taking over a lot of this, and it was still a lot of work to plan this move. So the trip actually ended up getting sort of shunted to the bottom of the list, and we never ended up planning anything. Basically, on the day that we left Durham in our car, we knew just a couple things. One, we knew where we were going to stay that night, which was with some family of mine. And we knew that we wanted to take about a week and a half to get cross country. And we knew that we wanted to visit some national parks like Yellowstone, etc. And that I had never been to before. So we had this like general idea of where we were going to go. We did arrange, I think, to meet up with some friends in Madison, Wisconsin, a couple days into the trip. And so we knew that was kind of another point, but we were even vague about like which day that would happen right up until we left. The other general idea that we had for the trip was to alternate long days of driving with days staying in one place and doing some kind of activity like visiting a national park. So basically what we did throughout the entire trip was when we woke up in the morning, we would decide where we were going to end the day, if it was going to be in the same place doing an activity in that city, or if we were going to have a long driving day and end in a different place. And we would arrange for our lodging for that night, in the morning. So it was really a seat of your pants kind of trip, which was very uncomfortable for us again. The other thing that made that kind of travel really challenging, of like booking everything on the fly, was that Kyle's phone, his iPhone, which he had with Verizon at the time, it died on day one of our trip. It basically could not charge anymore, and we actually stopped at like a couple different Apple stores on the trip to try to see if this could be fixed. But of course, you need appointments way out, and it just never worked for us to be actually like seen by anyone. So we were relying only on my phone for the entire duration of the trip. Now, I've been with Republic Wireless, which operates off the Sprint network, for many, many years, and I never had any problems with it except during this trip. Basically, once we got a little ways west of the Mississippi, we didn't really have phone service for most of the time unless we were in like a major city. We didn't know that was going to be the case, so we literally didn't have like a map with us. It really speaks to how dependent we had become on smartphones by that point. So in addition to planning out every morning where we were going to lay our heads that night and booking some lodging, we also had to plan out the directions that we would follow if we were doing like a long day of driving, because we had to know how to get to the place that we had booked, and we couldn't rely necessarily on having cell service after, as I said, about a third of the way through the trip. So I definitely would not recommend any of these things. If you're planning a cross-country road trip or vacation, please realize that you might not have cell service in some areas of the country. Please buy a paper map. Please plan out your routes more than a few hours in advance. I do not recommend any of this, but it was okay for us at that time. We got through it. It was still fun. It was fun to be spontaneous. We actually ended up, rerouting ourselves a couple times because of like weather conditions in one place or another. So it was nice to be able to change our plans at the last minute due to, factors that came up that we couldn't have anticipated. So here are the things that we ended up doing on this approximately week and a half cross-country road trip. We visited some extended family of mine, and we stayed one night with them. We visited and stayed one night with another friend of mine from grad school. We had dinner with a friend along the way. We spent a day at Six Flags. We had originally planned on going to Cedar Point, which we'd never been to, but because of weather, we rerouted and ended up going to Six Flags for a day. And we bought the their version of like the fast pass, where we could just go on, skip lines and go on tons of coasters. And we really wore ourselves out that day, and it was a lot of fun. We spontaneously went to this like outdoor festival and fish fry. And we visited a bunch of national parks. We went to Badlands National Park. We visited Mount Rushmore. We spent 2 full days and parts of 2 more days in Yellowstone National Park, which I'd never been to before. And it was so awesome to get to have, a relatively long trip there. And we did lots of hiking, and it was amazing. And if you look behind me, if you're watching the video, we have a bunch of our photos from those national parks up on the wall there. And we also went through Grand Teton National Park, and we had hoped to hit up Glacier National Park right before going into Seattle, but there were actually some like wildfires going on at that point. So we cut that part out of our trip and basically arrived in Seattle a little bit sooner than we had expected to. Again, about 1 week before Kyle's start date. So this was really a fantastic vacation and trip. We did end up eating out a lot, which of course is expensive. But we also at some points bought groceries and were able to prepare some of our own food, which was good. We had one snafu that I wanted to warn you about, which definitely caused us to overspend, and we felt some angst about this. So again, we're booking our travel like for that night, that morning, and we're usually using like our hotel or whatever Wi-Fi to do that because we couldn't rely on our phones. So we booked this one motel called the Bear Lodge Motel through Priceline. And again, we had the address for the motel, at that point in the morning when we booked it, and we wrote out our directions to it. But going on, on the road, we didn't have a map that we could reference. So when we actually arrived, after a long day of driving in that city, we were like peering around, as we're driving down the road that this motel is supposed to be on, and we're trying to find it, and we finally see a sign for it. And so we drive up and we go, and it's like it was weird. Like it was really late at night when we were arriving. There was no attendant there. We had to call a number, get them out. They didn't have our booking, and it was just really odd. So we had to basically like rebook, but they did have availability. So we had to rebook right then. And then once we got into like our room or our cabin, we realized that this was not the place that we had booked that morning through Priceline. We had ended up at the Bear Lodge Mountain Resort instead of the Bear Lodge Motel, which were, it turns out, about a mile apart on the same road. So we didn't verify the address of the place that we went to. We were just, we saw Bear Lodge and thought that was the right thing, but there's 2 of them on the same road. So we ended up paying for both nights of lodging, which is about $100 wasted, which at that time, that meant a lot to us to, lose out on $100. So we felt really bad about that mistake. And we were also really embarrassed by it. So if you ever find yourself in the same situation where you've booked through a third party, blah, 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 just make sure you actually showed up at the correct place. Okay, so ultimately, the cost of our cross-country road trip, the total cost, everything we did, was $2,317.97. Now, of that sum, we determined that $1,339.71 was the direct expenses to get us and our car with our remainder, the remaining part of our stuff across the country. So that was what we asked for reimbursement for. And then $978.26 of that was purely vacation stuff. So when we had, extra days we stayed in one location, we paid, that extra lodging went to our vacation expenses rather than the cross-country move expenses. Obviously, all the entertainment we did, that kind of stuff was all vacation expenses. So that was how the cost of that broke down. Okay, so final leg of the journey, we have arrived in Seattle and we do not yet know where we are going to live. And again, not having internet access for the last week approximately, except, at where we stayed in hotels and motels and stuff, we did not have any opportunity to do last minute searching for housing. So basically we arrived in Seattle and immediately had to commence with our housing search. So thankfully we had some friends who were already living in Seattle. So we had arranged to stay, a few nights with one friend, a few nights with another friend. So we knew we had up to around a week in housing taken care of while we conducted our search. So based on the research that I had done prior to when we left Durham, I determined that our ideal place to live would be a 2-bedroom, 1-bath apartment in an older building with 0 amenities to keep the cost down, because rent in Seattle, it's very expensive to live here. Even though we weren't living in the heart of downtown, as I said earlier, it's still pretty expensive. And we know that it's so important to keep housing costs down if you want to make your budget work overall. So we were really determined to keep our housing costs down. So that was the ideal place that I wanted to look for to sort of minimize our rent while still living comfortably enough. So we started seeing places in person on a Monday, and we saw 3 places between Monday and Tuesday. We had arrangements to see a 4th, but once we saw the 3rd place, we knew that it was exactly what we were looking for. The main selling point was that it was only 0.2 miles from Kyle's work. So he could literally walk from our apartment to his new workplace in like 3 minutes. So we saw the location of this place. We saw that it fit our criteria of being an older building. The rent was, on the reasonable side. And so we were like, within a couple minutes of like entering the place, we were like, yes, we're going to apply. We want this place. And we did end up like racing another couple who was at the same showing time to put down basically an earnest money deposit. So what this place allowed was, in addition to paying an application fee, you could put down an extra $500 to skip to the front of the application line. So the place already had some applications that were being processed. So we decided to put down the extra $500 to skip to the front of the line, have our application processed first, and, assuming that all went well, to get the place. And that $500 was able to go towards our security deposit. So it wasn't, wasted money unless we decided to turn down the place, which we definitely did not want to do. So that's what we did. We had to literally race around Seattle to get our money order in place. So this is also something that we weren't expecting. In Durham, the places that we had rented there, they always accepted personal checks for like the deposit and first month's rent and everything. We, in this place, needed to have a cashier's check or a money order. Now, this was actually an issue for us. So we had switched completely over to using internet-only banks. We bank with Ally. And that, so you can't get a cashier's check from an internet-only bank. So we had to get these money orders. But it turns out that, at least in this situation, money orders go against your daily ATM usage limit in certain locations, like at a post office. So we could get, I think it was $1,000 was our limit. So we could get like the first $1,000, but we needed a lot more money than that to put down for the apartment. So we ended up having to go to like different retailers and having them like try to process this money order differently. So this was not a hurdle that we expected. So I always love to recommend using internet-only banks, but just realize if you do switch over completely to using one, you have no brick and mortar bank access, that you might run into this kind of problem of having to get money orders or cashier's checks at the last second. So plan in advance, know your daily ATM limits. You can, anyway, get around this kind of problem. Okay, so I wanted to share our ultimate costs of actually getting into this rental unit. So we spent this is the amount of money we had to basically front. $302.48 for our application fee, a processing fee, and then the fees to get the money orders. We took possession of our apartment on July 31st, so we had to pay that 1 day's worth of rent plus all of August's rent up front. So it was $48 for the July 31st rent and $1,495 for the August. That's rent and water, sewer, and garbage, those fees all together. We also had to put down our security deposit, which was $1,375. So all told, that was $3,220.48 that we had to put down just to get into our new apartment in Seattle, which again was on the lower priced end of what we could find in Seattle. Plus, on top of that, we had already paid an entire month's rent in Durham before we left. And so we were expecting like a partial reimbursement because we had moved out a little bit early. But, that was, again, money that was already out the door. We hadn't yet received that reimbursement yet. So I wanted to share these numbers just to give you an idea of really how expensive it can be to move to an expensive area of the country. So if you've never tried to execute a long distance move, if you've never tried living in a high cost of living city before, this is the kind of money that we had to spend to get to Seattle. And again, up to $5,000, not quite $5,000, was reimbursed by Kyle's employer, but still we are out and we had to front a lot of money just to get into our apartment, for example. The other thing that happens when you're moving is that your other costs kind of go up. Like we had to eat out a lot, not had to, but we ended up eating out a lot in Durham in the days that we were like packing up because again, we were like closing down our kitchen. We couldn't cook as much. We didn't have time to cook as much. So there's sort of increased expenses like that happen. And likewise in Seattle, while we're, moving into the apartment, we still had to like feed ourselves. So we ate out a lot, during the week we were doing our housing search. We weren't going to be cooking in our, friends' apartments or wherever. So we ate out a lot. And then to stock our pantry, I remember we spent in 1 month on groceries, like in August, we spent about double what we had typically been spending in Durham on groceries. And again, that's just like stocking our pantries and so forth. So it's pretty expensive food wise. Like don't forget about that expense when you're moving, is that you'll probably be spending more on feeding yourself than you typically do. So this story, I hope, had embedded in it a lot of advice for you if you are planning a long distance move or a cross country vacation. However, within the story, there are a few things, that I wish we had done differently in retrospect. The first one, which I kind of already alluded to, is to actually plan our cross country trip in advance. There were some advantages to doing everything spontaneously, but it would have been less stressful for us and definitely less expensive if we had just planned this stuff in advance. Especially now that I know a lot more about like travel hacking, I think that we could have done the lodging part of this trip a lot less expensively. So it definitely didn't have to cost as much as it did. But we had a good time. It is what it is. However, if I had to do it again, I would spend the time to plan it in advance, even though we felt really strapped for time at that point when we were leaving Durham. It's still an important thing, and I wish we had planned it more in advance. Secondly, regarding the moving itself, I wish we had gotten rid of more stuff. I mean, we did downsize to a degree when we were still in Durham. We sold things, we gave things away, especially like our furniture and stuff. But we ended up bringing a lot of stuff with us that honestly, some of it stayed in boxes for like months or like a year after we had moved. So clearly we did not need whatever was in those boxes if it took us that long to unpack it. So we definitely could have downsized more, being a little bit more ruthless in what do we really need to bring with us at the front end of that. And finally, as I said, we only saw the apartment that we currently live in for like a few minutes before we decided to move in. Now we had done research in the general, housing and so forth. Like we knew what we were looking for. So we were able to make that quick decision, but I don't think we were thinking forward as much as we should have. So like I said, when we moved to Seattle, we wanted to have a baby soon, and we definitely didn't want to move again locally soon. So we could have anticipated that, this is the place that we would live in when we had our first child. And in fact, now we have 2 children still living in the same place. So something that I really wish we had thought more about was the fact that our apartment does not have a dishwasher and it does not have a washer and dryer. There is a shared washer and dryer unit within the building that's coin operated. Now, that all was fine when it was just the 2 of us. But now that we have 2 children, we do a lot of dishes and we do a lot of laundry. And it's like crazy the amount of time that we spend doing dishes and laundry. And it would be a lot more convenient if we had a dishwasher and laundry facilities within our unit. So I wish we had thought ahead a little bit more. We definitely would be paying more in rent to have those amenities within our unit, but it would be so worth it by this point. It didn't really matter at that point, but we should have thought ahead to when we were a little bit more strapped for time and generating a lot more, dirty dishes and dirty clothes. Thank you guys so much for joining me on today's episode. I'm focusing a lot on thinking about moving this summer. If you want to read some more articles and some more material on how to move well and start up well with respect to your finances in a new city and with a new job, I invite you to go to pfforphds.com/next. That's NEXT. To see lots more material there. There's tons of articles as well as a couple webinars, and I'm available for coaching on this process as well. So please go check that out if you are anticipating or in the middle of a career transition and or a move to another city. I firmly believe that you can set yourself up for financial success in any given career stage on your PhD journey if you are very careful and thoughtful about the fixed expenses that you lock yourself into when you move to a new place. So that's kind of what those focus on, as well as minimizing moving expenses. So you can learn from this episode, you can learn from my experience, but I've also learned a lot more since then. So you can benefit from that research again by going to pfforphds.com/next. Listeners, I'm so glad you joined us for today's episode. pfforphds.com/podcast is the hub for the Personal Finance for PhDs podcast. There, you can find links to all the episode show notes, a form to volunteer to be interviewed, a survey, and a way to join the mailing list. I'd love for you to check it out and get more involved. See you in the next episode. The music is Stages of Awakening by Poddington Bear from the Free Music Archive and is shared under CC by NC. Podcast editing and show notes creation by Jewel Lips.